Hello and welcome to the Africa Fashion Podcast. On this research podcast series, we share insights and expertise on the fascinating world of African fashion. You'll hear from academics and industry experts and learn about the opportunities and innovations they see in African fashion and the work of African designers. My name is Dr. Lauren England. I will be your podcast host for this episode. I'm a lecturer in creative economies at King's College London. I've been working with my colleagues Dr. Eka Ikpe, Director of the African Leadership Centre, and Roberta Communion, Professor of Creative Economies in the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries, researching African fashion and creative economy development in Africa since 2019. This podcast series is supported by the African Leadership Centre, the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries, and a Global Engagement Partnership Fund from King's College London. This episode is a conversation with Professor Jen Snowball. Jen is a Professor of Economics at Rhodes University, South Africa, and also a researcher at the South African Cultural Observatory, SACO. In this podcast, we'll be talking about the South African Textile, Shweshwe, focusing on how intellectual property rights in the design space can have a real impact on the livelihoods of microenterprises. So Jen, could you start off just telling me a bit about what interests you about Shweshwe?
Well, firstly, it's related to the fabric, so it's a kind of very high quality cotton, but the real kind of fashion and design element is the printing process that happens with that. And I guess what attracted me to it was, well, firstly, the factory that produces it invited us to come and do some research, not so much on what they were doing, but on how it was being used. And for South Africans, Shweshwe is kind of an interesting heritage fabric, if I can call it that, but very mixed heritage. So it's originally came from Germany. So in some places it's referred to as Blauwdruk, right, which you can hear blue press, I suppose. And that's because it came across with German missionaries. It was actually also made in the UK. So it's got a kind of colonial flavory history to it. But the iconography has been changed and its meaning has been changed. So it's one of those things that's become part of African cultures now and is something that you would use for kind of special occasions when you go to church or if there's a wedding. Or if there's a birthday party or something like that. So I guess what was interesting to me was the kind of background heritage and the complexity of the heritage that was making this very unique and individual fabric in South Africa.
Amazing. You mentioned it was sort of the use of the fabric that you were being asked to look at. And you mentioned how it's being used in, for celebrations and outfits like that. What did you find when you did start looking into the use of this fabric?
So the factory, there's only one factory in quite a sort of rural area in South Africa. They were interested in who was buying the Shweshwe. And so what we did was that we hung around in shops that sold it and interviewed people basically who were buying the fabric, especially people who were buying it in order to use it to make special custom-made garments for their clients. So it was like the kind of micro industry of Shweshwe bespoke tailors that we were tracking. It was easier to do than it sounds because Shweshwe is sold only in quite small shops. So the factory deliberately doesn't sell to big chain stores or to companies that mass market kind of garments. So it's only sold as fabric, not as ready sewn garments, and in these small little shops, which they actually refer to as kind of mom and pop shops. But there's history to that as well, which was that these were the rural trading stations of long ago, right, in more rural areas. And so the factory itself had a personal relationship with the people who were selling their fabrics, and they've tried to keep that. And so it was really the people who were buying the Shweshwe to make these special garments that we were interviewing in various places in South Africa, some smaller towns. We did Cape Town, so a bigger place or a bigger city, just to try and see what it was about, how they were using it, what how it was part of their business, and what kind of issues they were having in terms of struggles in their particular use of the fabric. Yeah.
And was that struggles of people using the fabric, and what were the the issues that were coming up?
So the main issue was that a lot of counterfeit shweshwe was coming in, not only as fabric, but also as ready-sewn garments. So it looked like shweshwe, but some of the designs were copied. Sometimes their trademark was also copied, but it wasn't the real thing or the authentic thing. And you could tell that because of the quality of the fabric. So it wasn't cotton, it was some kind of polycotton mix, and also the designs, which are very carefully printed in a whole lot of different processes using organic materials, were obviously not on the cheaper ones. And so the concern of the factory for themselves, but also for the micro enterprises that use the shweshwe, was that they were being undercut by these sort of cheap, I suppose using the word fake is a bit difficult, but anyway, not authentic, counterfeit shweshwe products. And so that was a big challenge for them. And most of the micro enterprises were owned and operated by women, mostly by Black women, sometimes working from home. So, really small, they didn't have studios or anything like that. And they work with clients who come to them with a specific idea. So I'm going to a birthday party or a wedding or a special event of some sort, and I want to have a shweshwe dress made. And then they wouldn't call themselves designers. I guess they would say they were tailors or sewers. They work with the client to say, okay, what kinds of shweshwe would you like? It comes in all sorts of different amazing colors and designs. So you would normally choose more than one to make the garment, and then you can choose from a whole lot of different designs how you want it to look, if you're a man or a woman. So it's kind of, you can use it for both, but it's expensive, right? It's high quality cotton. It's printed very exactly in very fine designs. So the factory has a really good and efficient quality control process, and so there is some wastage, when the process doesn't quite work out, and that also increases the cost of the shweshwe. And so I guess if you're really constrained in terms of budget, then you might be tempted to buy one of the cheaper counterfeit ones that are sold in little shops along the high street or around the back corner or whatever it was. Yeah. And that's a really, I think that is a real challenge for the micro enterprises. They had really good ways of telling what was authentic. So we asked them, do you know that there are these kind of other kinds of shweshwe? We didn't use the word fake or counterfeit. And they said, yes, we know, but we have ways of telling which ones are authentic. And those are the ones that they wanted to work with, right? And so the copyright is an interesting mix of the attributes of the fabric and the official kind of copyright stamps, so there's the trademark on the back, but they said they also use things like the price. Okay, so is this suspiciously cheap? The quality of the fabric, the quality of the printing, the colors and designs, because they knew which were the more traditional and which were the newer designs, but also the fact that it was starched, which gives it a very specific smell and taste. So some people said taste. They use taste as a measure and I suppose that's also related to the organic dyes, So the feel and the taste and the smell of the fabric were also something that they were using to determine authenticity.
So that's obviously like a consumer way of interpreting the authenticity and identifying that. Was that something that the producers of Shweshwe were also actively implementing as a distinguishing factor?
Yes, as particularly when it comes to the smell and the taste. So, they were one thing they were trying very hard to do was to prosecute anybody who copied the back stamp, their kind of logo, which is this really beautiful 3 cats logo that goes on the back of the fabric. The reason it was starched was that originally it was imported from the UK, I think from Manchester, and to protect it from the seawater, because it all came by ship, then you would starch the cotton to kind of help preserve and protect it. And of course that's not needed anymore. I mean, it's produced in South Africa now. So they thought, well, we should stop doing this because it's actually a bit of a pain. If you're sewing with shweshwe, you have to wash it first to get the starch out before you can actually start working with it. And so they stopped the starching process, which is quite expensive if you're doing like hundreds of thousands of meters of fabric. And the buyers did not like it because they were like, well, no, this can't be the real thing because it doesn't it doesn't look and smell and taste like the original Shweshwe. So they actually had to go back to doing the starching process. And it was particularly kind of in the rural areas, where people weren't really relying on things like back stamps or, copyright or whatever. They wanted it to look and smell and feel like the authentic thing. But the consumers are also really proud of the fact that they've bought the original Three Cats Shweshwe. So the stamp goes on the back of the fabric. So normally you wouldn't see it if you'd made your skirt or top or dress or whatever. And but some of the designers told us that the customers request them to flip it over. So to have a pocket, say, that incorporates the Three Cats logo to show that this is the authentic, valuable, original Shweshwe. So it obviously is important for some people. Yeah.
Yes, it's an interesting way of people sort of almost creating it as a branded item, even though it's a garment that they've had constructed by a tailor, or maybe it's done by a designer, but it's bearing the brand of the Shweshwe is the important signifier of value in that context.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So it is a kind of branding, and as you say, not so much of the design of the garment, but the design and the quality of the fabric itself. So Shweshwe has like the older designs, which are the organic indigo color. There's a brown color, and there's also kind of a dark red color, and those are the ones that were originally there. And they would come in those colors and then white and black, right? So the designs would be quite simple. But the factories now started producing what they call fancy print, which has got 4 colors, which is actually much harder to do because you've got to run the fabric 4 times through the machine, and because the patterns are so fine, you have to line it up absolutely perfectly to get the printing kind of just right. And so the fancy print ones come in a whole lot of new gorgeous colors, not organic, right? So these are the kind of new industrial dyes that they're using, but they appeal to like young modern Africans. We started seeing them in things like Cape Town Fashion Week, or at the opening of Parliament, somebody would have this gorgeous Shweshwe dress. But you're quite right. We're not recognizing the designer. We're all going, "Oh, look, it's Shweshwe," And there's sort of new attempts to try and put the design in there as important. So there's a brand name now called Shwe, who does bags and hats and kind of accessories, but made out of the Shweshwe designs themselves. So it's an interesting one. It's the fabric and the fabric design that's the focus, rather than how the garment looks.
It's really interesting. You mentioned that one of the strategies the companies were employing to try and protect, particularly the trademark, was prosecution of counterfeit Shweshwe producers. Do you know how successful they've been in that, if it's what challenges they've come up against in trying to do that?
Yeah, so well, firstly, they employed a lawyer to write kind of cease and desist letters to the owners of market stalls, usually, or small shops that were selling the counterfeit. But the problem is the people selling the counterfeit things would just very quickly pack up and move, so they were really difficult to pin down. So they never managed to prosecute anybody. But at least they made it known that if we find you using our logo, we will do something about it, even if it's not very effective. But they protect their kind of IP or copyright, I suppose, by staying ahead of the pack. So they employ designers now in the factory who work with the original designs, which are very old, from like the 1800s, early 1900s, that they inherited. Because when the factory in the UK closed down, this particular South African factory bought all of their stock equipment, the rollers they used for making the patterns, as well as their kind of master pattern book, which we actually saw. It's a sort of really ancient, stuck together collage kind of a book. So they employ designers now who use those as the base materials and then design new versions of the Shweshwe. So it's still recognizably Shweshwe in some important ways. So that you would definitely say, oh yes, I know what that is, right? But you can see that they've modernized the designs as well and made them more sort of trendy. And so they reckon they just need to do that all the time, so that the people who are copying the patterns will always be kind of one step behind. Where they're having problems with the originals, the kind of the heritage designs, if we can call it that. They're simple, they're really easy to copy, and it's difficult to manage that. You can't innovate them really easily, but because they've got this whole new fancy print range, they can just keep innovating, which keeps them people wanting to buy the new ones. But anybody can design Shweshwe. So they also do things like the King's birthday Shweshwe. If you wanted to have, you have to buy 10,000 meters at a time, warning, right? But they would have a special Shweshwe design that comes out. And for a while it's restricted, so it's only for that particular event or that particular person, and then they would release it to the public later on in the year.
That's really interesting, with all the different kind of adaptation strategies, and also how they're sort of adapting and evolving a heritage brand into these more contemporary designs as a means of, as you said, staying ahead of the game in terms of being copied. Is there any element of that that's also about kind of appealing to a different generation of consumer, an alternative market as well?
Yeah, I think so. So the really old heritage designs, just in the 3 colors, the sort of very simple ones, those were often seen as very traditional, conservative, so if you think about where they came from, these were things that you wore to go to church, or, they were given as presents to newly married women, or, so there's this sort of strong conservative old-fashioned link to them. And so I think that by making the designs new and contemporary and interesting, but still recognizable, then it's a kind of a way of bridging that divide. So you can still kind of wear clothes that are very South African, that link to your heritage, but that look really trendy and new and interesting. And I think that's what's driving the sort of modern demand for Shweshwe.
And you mentioned it having a kind of, the heritage designs having quite a conservative traditional association. Was anything there in your research thinking about the legacy maybe of this fabric as a UK produced textile being brought into South Africa and retail there, becoming adopted as a South African textile, and South African print being very emblematic of that? Was there anything that came through about that sort of the colonial relationship and what that's tied to?
Not from the people who were using it, right? They were mostly interested in the fabric and the new designs and the what was coming out, and they have quite a good relationship with the factory, but also with the shops where they buy the fabric from. So there would be sort of discussions, about how it was used and why people were buying it or what they preferred. But there didn't seem to be much of I don't know if it's realization or maybe just no kind of worry about it having potentially colonial roots. Where we did find that was in government, when we tried to sort of engage with them around how we could prevent some of the counterfeit products from coming in kind of illegally without being having to pay, the right import duties and so on, which is what the factory had been trying to do for ages. But there wasn't really much appetite for that. And then it was like, well, this is not really, a sort of truly African tradition anyway. But for the people who were wearing it and the people who were buying it, they didn't see it that way at all. They saw this as, sort of wonderful heritage South African kind of fabric. So I think there's maybe a bit of a disjuncture between how government officials and public policy see this as kind of a hybrid not worthy of protection versus how sort of people in the street would see it. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I think it's also maybe a point of distinction between Shweshwe and other African textiles that we see in other places across the continent, and how they have also similar kind of production sort of international and colonial context, and then the local adoption of that and turning it into this idea of what is an African textile and an African print. It's interesting that that wasn't perhaps so much of at the forefront of people's minds when they were discussing this one. Is Shweshwe the dominant kind of fabric in South Africa that is thought of as South African textile or fabric, or are there others as well?
Gosh, good question. I'm not sure I can really answer it, but I mean, if we think of traditional South African sort of, if I'm thinking of Xhosa or Zulu traditional dress, the focus is often on the beading rather than the fabric, you know. So I think in terms of printed fabric, Shweshwe is probably the one that most people would recognize. But then there's also a whole class of traditional beading and beaded outfits and things that happen with ribbons. And so then it's more about the adornment than the fabric, if you know what I mean. The fabric sometimes quite plain, but it's how it's been used in the design that's really would mark it out as, oh yes, we recognize that. And
you mentioned that obviously there've been an attempt to get policy makers involved to regulate this that was perhaps not particularly successful. Are there other policies or kind of trade arrangements that were being discussed that might help the domestic production of Shweshwe, or also perhaps things that are currently in place that are hindering the local development opportunities?
Well, I mean, there's a huge potential if the African Continental Free Trade Area works out, right? But there hasn't been like a lot of discussion about what that means for culture and intellectual property. So it's been more focused on like exports of goods and services and more traditional things, rather than saying, well, what are we going to do about design and fabric and fashion and other kinds of cultural products. So that's possibly a helpful thing that could happen there. But yeah, there are import tariffs, quite high import tariffs on clothing and fabrics that are imported into South Africa. But it seems that the people who are applying them are not necessarily recognizing counterfeit versus original, right? So they're not checking very carefully. Firstly, that sort of what it says on the box is actually in the box. And secondly, if you opened up a huge container and saw these, Shweshwe garments with the stamp on the back, you would need to know that was not original. So one of the things that the factory was lobbying for was an opportunity to kind of work with the officials who were dealing with imports and tariffs and so on, to try and educate them to say, well, this is what our product looks like. And if you see something like this that doesn't come from us, it's almost certainly, a fake. We'll have to see how that goes. I think that the research that we did, which was around the microenterprises, and we found, we estimated there were about 6,000 of them in South Africa, these little tiny businesses, mostly owned by women, a lot of them in rural areas, sometimes employing another person. So I think our sort of average size was 2.15 people employed, but mostly, just one person. So the idea was to try and demonstrate, I think, to government just how important the Shweshwe sewing business was and how much it was worth in terms of money. And most of the people that we spoke to said, well, this is like 80% of our business. So if there was a big flood of Shweshwe, fake Shweshwe garments coming in, it would seriously undermine their ability to employ people to carry on working in their own businesses, because they really don't do anything else. They're quite specialist Shweshwe tailors.
Just for those of our listeners who aren't perhaps sort of aware of what the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is proposing, is there really sort of key areas we think where those opportunities are sitting in terms of the cultural sector in particular for supporting that?
The African Union has got something called Agenda 2063, which is kind of a sort of aspirational document of how they see African economies and cultures being recognized and developed in the future. And part of that is the sort of protection but also promotion of African cultural elements. So there's a proposal for a gigantic African Union museum. So that's, part of, I suppose, taking back agency around showing African cultural artifacts and African cultures. And that's kind of hopeful for us who work in the creative industries, because we're sort of thinking, well, this could be, one place where we could start talking about potential trade and also, just having an intercontinental focus on what is available. At the moment, South Africa imports a lot of cultural content, might not be goods, might be services, right? I'm thinking Netflix and music and things that are not actually physically there from the West. Then you also have these interesting things like the Nigerian movie industry, which everyone sort of sat up and took notice of, and more fashion weeks popping up. So the hope is that when the big ticket items like energy and water and food have been negotiated, then there would be possibilities to think about both cultural trade but also protection, right? So, and it would be more effective than it is at the moment.
And I think what you've highlighted in the discussion so far is the production of a fabric like Shweshwe and the sort of the fashion and dress ecosystem that it's feeding into actually has quite significant kind of economic kind of weight behind it when you look into it in much greater detail. So if you what is the role of kind of research into this area, maybe in supporting that kind of policy development?
Well, I think it's really important to know, just as you say, what the ecosystem is. 75% of the businesses or the business owners that we talked to were operating informally. In other words, their business was not registered, so it wouldn't show up on any kind of official data or statistics. And that didn't affect their turnover, so contrary to industrial organization theory that says formal is good, in this context, it really didn't make a difference whether you were one of the quarter who were actually registered or whether you were operating informally. And we made it a very low bar. We said, do you have a bank account in the name of your business, right? And so most people said, well, no, we're just working kind of individually under the radar. But we didn't even follow it further. I mean, I think some of the garments are kind of ready-made and then sold in markets, for example, almost as an advertisement for what a particular tailor can do. And we didn't follow up on those kinds of linkages as well. So I think the ecosystem goes further. And we've also noticed that there've been a growing export market. So you can now find Shweshwe in Canada, but some of that you would be able to track. So you can, it's official, it's reported for tax purposes, whatever. But the 75% of the microenterprises wouldn't show up at all unless you actually went and spoke to people. And so I think that is important, just in terms of finding out how reliant they are on the product, but also linking it back to the big, I suppose, socioeconomic challenges in South Africa about employment and job creation and good jobs, and economic growth. So without this research, I guess we wouldn't have known just how big the sector was or how valuable.
From the research that you've done so far on Shweshwe, what are the key things that you would like to follow up on? The things that you found most interesting as an economist, for example?
Okay, well, one of the surprises for me was that 28% of the people who were working in these small businesses had post-school education, but had still chosen to remain operating their business informally. So the question then is, why? Because normally you would think, well, small informal businesses would tend to be run by people who, maybe have some problems keeping accounts or something like that. But that clearly wasn't the case here. That's a much higher percentage for South Africa than the sort of general working population, to have post-school education. So one of the things I was thinking about was what are the trade-offs? So economists would never say, well, people are, lazy or maybe dishonest. They would say, no, they've made a logical decision. They've weighed up the benefits of operating formally and the costs, and they've chosen logically what to do. And so the question is, well, why have they made that choice? Because if you're operating informally, okay, you're not having to pay tax or report, but on your business activities. But on the other hand, you wouldn't pay tax below below a certain level anyway. And you would potentially have access to things like loans or government support or IP protection. There would be some, and there's quite a lot of focus in South Africa on supporting microenterprises, particularly microenterprises run by women. But clearly it's not fitting this sector. And so I think this is one situation where maybe the creative industries need some specialist kind of research or support, or there's something that's causing a mismatch for this particular group that's preventing them from formalizing. And although being a formally registered business didn't affect your turnover, it did affect how many people you employed. So being a formally registered business almost always meant you were employing more people. So if we really want to talk about, job creation in the creative industries and innovation and, driving growth, we need to find out what is it about the current microenterprise support that South Africa is offering that absolutely does not appeal to women working in some of the creative industry sectors. So yeah, that I guess is where I'd like to take this further.
Well, we very much look forward to hearing how your future research endeavours go. I think it's an amazing example of an area of the fashion ecosystem, and particularly looking at the production of the textiles that are then taken on by designers, the production networks that go into them, but also that value adding process that's being used and what that means for the consumer as well. It's a great kind of case study as to understand an element of interaction in that ecosystem, as we talked about, and amazing directions for future research as well. So I'd like to finish up and say thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights and research with us. We will maybe hope to get you back on another podcast later on when you've done some more digging into the Shweshwe production system and those issues around microenterprise development and support and policy that could factor into that. But yeah, thank you very much, Jen Snowball, for your for coming on the Africa Fashion podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Africa Fashion Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed hearing about Shweshwe and Jen's work. If you'd like to find out more, you can read Jen's article, Creative Industries, Microenterprises and Informality, a case study of the Shweshwe sewing industry in South Africa, in the Journal of Cultural Economy from 2021. You can find a link to this paper in the show notes on the website. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again for another episode of the Africa Fashion Podcast.